Hi, in the present module, I'd like to talk about Zionism and the beginnings of the Zionist movement, the important founders and the important leaders of the Zionist movement. And when you think about Zionism, you really have to ask yourself, how could this movement have possibly succeeded? 100 years ago, there were between 50 and 80,000 Jews in the land of Israel. Today, there are over 6 million. The idea of a Jewish state was inconceivable. And you also have to ask yourself, what kind of person would devote his or her life to the Zionist cause, because its success was so implausible. There were so many contradictions in it. There were so many pitfalls in it. Let me just mention a few of the problems which would have deterred any sane person from aspiring to become a Zionist leader. There was this tension within the Zionist movement between this idea of normalcy. We're going to turn the Jews into a normal people like any other, give us our own homeland, and we'll simply be one of the many nations. And then this notion of specialness, of chosenness, that the Jews are not like any other people, and that they shouldn't just found any other state. There was also this tension that came from Zionism's having to deny the diaspora. It took a lot of chutzpah to get up and say, our future is in the land of Israel, it's not in the diaspora. Our future is with Hebrew, it's not with Yiddish. After all, at the beginning of the 20th century, it was Yiddish that was undergoing an amazing transformation. The rise of an important, respected Yiddish literature and Yiddish theater, the rise of a Yiddish mass press, dailies in Europe and the United States. Yiddish had millions and millions of speakers, and among Jews it was finally, after centuries of derision, gaining new respect. And hardly anybody spoke Hebrew. And yet Zionism said these millions and millions of Jews in the diaspora really don't have a future there. The future is in the land of Israel. That took a lot of gall or self-confidence to say that. It seemed that to be a Zionist meant that you kind of had to deny reality. You had to live in fantasy. And indeed, there was one debate between Chaim Zhitlovsky, a theoretician of Yiddishism and diaspora identity, and Nachman Sirkin, a theoretician of left-wing labor Zionism. And it was Sirkin who said to Zhitlovsky, you know, let's make a deal. You could own what's real, and I could own what's a dream. And I believe that the dream has a better future than that reality that you're defending. There were yet other problems with Zionism. When Jews did emigrate, and certainly millions of Jews emigrated, they voted with their feet to go to other lands, to the United States, to South Africa, to Argentina, to Great Britain. for every Jew who went to Palestine before 1914, 100 went to the U.S. And a question hovers, a question kind of hangs in the air. Could there have been a Jewish state at all had the United States not closed its doors in 1924? Is it not true that the real growth of the Jewish community in Palestine, the so-called Yishuv, in the 20s and 1930s, from 80,000 to 180,000 in 1929, to 350,000 in the mid-30s, to close to 500,000 by the beginning of World War II, that the growth of the Yishuv had more to do with America's closing the doors and then the rise of Hitler than it did with any great yearning of the Jewish people to go to Palestine. Now, I'm not saying that Jews didn't think of Palestine, cherish it, value it. I am saying that if you're judging a movement by the signals that it's getting from Jewish behavior in the present, Zionism was, for all intents and purposes, not necessarily getting a lot of traction before World War II. We can cite other facts. While American Jewry showed a great outpouring of support for Zionism in World War I, and getting Justice Louis Brandeis to serve as the head of the American Zionist Organization was a real coup. Support for and interest in Zionism waned in the 1920s. And indeed, judging just in terms of dollars, American Jews sent more dollars to the Soviet Union to help the Soviet government and the Joint Distribution Committee settle Jews in the Crimea and in the Ukraine in new farms than American Jews sent to Palestine. In the Warsaw municipal elections of 1938, of the 20 Jewish seats on the Warsaw City Council, the anti-Zionist Bund got 17. So to be a convinced Zionist leader, as I said, showed a lot of real dedication. Now, we can compare Ben-Gurion, Weizmann, Theodor Herzl. We could compare them to other great leaders of their people, like Parnell of Ireland, or Pilsudski of Poland, or Mandela, South Africa, or Garibaldi or Mazzini in Italy. But at least those leaders were dealing with peoples who were living on their own land. Zionist leaders were dealing with Jews who were not living in Palestine. Those peoples, with those leaders, with the exception of Parnell, did not have to worry about reviving a national language. The Zionist movement not only had to get Jews to come to the land of Israel, but they had to revive a language that nobody could thought would be turned once again into a living language, and that today is the language of 6 million people. So the sheer scope of the success of the Zionist movement, looking back, despite all the many problems that Israel faces, this is one of the great success stories in modern history. It's of all the isms of the 19th century, this is the ism that has shown the most staying power and the most traction. Now, what are some of the factors which contributed to the development of Zionism as a political movement? And I think you understood from my remarks on the Haskalah that while the Haskalah, which is not an organized movement. It was not a political party. It was not a movement that is very easy to define, but it had some general assumptions and hopes. It assumed that Jews could be Jews and Europeans at the same time. It also was very optimistic about the Jews' future in Europe. That optimism you can see in Yehuda Leib Gordon's poem, Awake My People. That optimism, that anti-Semitism, hatred of Jews, is somehow linked to the past, to backwardness, to lack of education. That with more enlightenment, with more education, with modernization, with industrialization, the Jews will find much firmer footing in Europe. They'll be accepted. They'll be accepted in such a way that they can happily live as Europeans, Germans, Frenchmen, Poles in the public space, and as proud Jews in their private space. This optimism suffered some very rude shocks beginning in the last quarter of the 19th century.